All right, so you want your YouTube videos or Twitch streams to sound really nice, but you're not really sure where to start with all this audio stuff? Welcome to the video. That's actually what we're talking about today. If you've never really given much thought to your audio before, I've got great news for you. You can only really go up from here, right? And there are only about 3 things that you really have to learn to take your audio to the next level for YouTube or Twitch or any other video platform you want to work on. Now, obviously, every voice and microphone are going to be different. And unfortunately, that does mean that there's not one perfect way for all this to get set up for everybody. But what we can do is walk through 3 steps that'll really help you get a baseline level of polish on your audio, and it'll really set you apart from other creators. Those steps are frequency control, dynamics control, and volume control. And if that sounds too technical for you, I promise it's not. You could totally do this, and you can do it for free. You don't even necessarily need to have a nice microphone to make your audio sound just heaps better. So before you go out and drop a bunch of money on that, check out these tips and see if they work for you. All right, so let's get into it. Step 1. Frequency control. At the risk of oversimplifying and making audio engineers in the comments mad, you can think of any sound as being composed of one or more frequencies, vibrations at different rates. So maybe a pure sine wave like this one, it has one tone, one frequency, right? The human voice has just so many more. Harmonics and overtones and bass tones, just all sorts of frequency information in the human voice. And sometimes those frequencies just suck to listen to. They're just really bad, and you don't want to hear them in your recording or your Twitch stream. And the frequencies that suck to listen to the most are, widely subjective. But most of us tend to agree that we don't like hearing overly sibilant sounds, those S sounds. They cut through the mix really well. Our ears are sort of just predisposed to hear that frequency range better, and so they seem louder in a mix. Other unpleasant frequencies might be found lower in the bass register, especially for some deeper voices. You might get this sort of boomy sounding bass frequency that kind of just comes out and punches you in the eardrum, and we can tame those back a little bit as well. And the way that we tame those unpleasant frequencies is a process called equalization, or EQ. You know EQ. It's that thing in your car on the dashboard with the sliders for bass, middle, and treble. You've got bass set to 10 right now, I know you do. And those sliders on the screen in your car are actually like a super basic version of a parametric EQ, right? We use the sliders to increase or decrease certain frequencies, and we're gonna do that with your voice as well. And whether you're working with live audio, like on Twitch, or you're working with audio in post, like you're editing for YouTube, you're probably gonna use a VST plugin to accomplish this EQ. And honestly, you can use any EQ plugin that you happen to like, right? But if you don't have one yet, might I recommend TDR Nova. Nova by Tokyo Dawn Records is a free and extremely full-featured EQ plugin. This is what we'd actually call a dynamic equalizer, and that's gonna come into play a little bit later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. All right, I've temporarily turned off my EQ settings so that you can hear what this sounds like before I apply them. When I'm recording, I happen to notice a couple of things that I think need to be smoothed out. Firstly, those sibilant S sounds come in really sharp, somewhere around here. When I say the S sounds, you get a big spike right over here. That's where those S frequencies tend to live, at least in my voice and on this microphone. And the other area I tend to work on my own voice with this mic is down here, sort of in the 100 to 200 hertz range. Anyone who's talking in sort of like chest voice down here in this sort of register, you might also have this sort of buildup of deep, boomy frequencies that are just kind of muddy. They just kind of like bounce weird off of the walls and they sound odd, right? So if we can tame those a little bit, we can get more of my true character of my voice. So I come over here and I flip on the first one here, and you might already hear a bit of a difference, right? There's a little bit less of a resonant buildup down here in the bass. And that's because I've dialed in the frequency. It's about 160 hertz for my voice, where this problem frequency is. And I've turned it down, I don't know, almost 2 dB. It's not very much. You can feel the absence of it a little more clearly than you can feel the presence of it. And I'll turn it off and talk a little bit, and maybe you can hear some of that deep boomy frequency that I'm talking about. I'll turn it back on, and hey, they're a little chilled out. They're not gone. It's still a characteristic of my voice. I don't want to go down here and yank all these frequencies down. You start to lose a lot of the human quality there. But if I leave it somewhere around 2, 1.9, 1.8, somewhere in there, reasonable, you're gonna get a lot of reduction of those weird frequencies that you're not digging. And as a general rule, I wouldn't remove more than, 3 dB from any frequency range at a time. I think that's kind of the sweet spot. I think anything more than that, it starts to get a little odd. For me, there's another frequency somewhere around here in the like, I don't know, 1000-ish hertz zone. And I like to remove a little bit of that as well. And you can just kind of hear that kind of brings out the lows and highs of my voice and removes some of the muddy middle bits. It sounds a little more akin to what I sound like in person if I remove these frequencies out. And I prefer the sound of that. And you can see I've got, again, -1.5 dB here, right on, I don't know, 1000-ish hertz. And I've got this Q setting. This Q, it defines like how tight and wide that band is, right? I think I had it somewhere, I don't know, around here, give or take. You want to go by how it sounds and not so much the numbers that you're dialing in. But again, I mean, we can kind of A and B that, right? So here it is on, here it is removed. I feel like there's a little bit more mud somewhere in the middle there. I like to tame a little bit of that out by giving this extra curve right in the middle. Another thing I like to do for, you know, my voice, this microphone, this room, etc. You get it. I don't have to keep qualifying it, right? I'm going to throw a low pass filter on the whole thing. And a low pass filter does what it says on the tin. It's going to let the low frequencies pass through the filter, and anything above a certain threshold is going to get cut off. For me, I have mine currently set to, I don't know, 16K, and we're going to roll off those higher frequencies. In my microphone, my setup here, mostly those are just kind of static hiss noises, you know, from the ambient sounds of the room, from the computer, from the electricity that's powering the microphone, things like that. Extremely important to note, again, I said I wouldn't qualify this, but I feel that I have to. You might not need a low pass filter, just like you might not need these other cuts. You're gonna have to listen to what your voice sounds like and play with those settings a little bit. And unfortunately, that's sort of the fiddly part. But back to low pass filter. You might recognize the low pass filter as that like DJ club sound where everything gets like really soft and ambient. It sounds like it's coming through the walls, right? But what I use it for on my voice is to kind of tame some of those upper, harsher frequencies. And you just kind of dial into wherever it feels correct for your voice. Unfortunately, this is going to require some trial and error. If you're doing this in post, easy peasy. You know, if you're working in Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, something like that, you can kind of tweak these settings in real time. In OBS, you might have to, you know, record this with this filter on your voice, listen back to it, make some changes, re-record it, rinse, repeat. But for me, I find somewhere right around here. Sounds pretty good. And the last thing I want to touch on in this section is something that I just don't see an awful lot of people making use of, especially on the Twitch side of things. You know how I said that those sibilant S sounds are really distracting and they cut through a mix really well? We can remove those through a process called de-essing, aptly named. And the reason that I suggest you pick up TDR Nova rather than just like a standard EQ is that we want to make use of some of these dynamic EQ settings. Wait, what does that mean? Hey, I'm glad you asked. Check it out. We are going to toggle on this third band here. We're going to move the frequency over where I see those S sounds, right? You can see the spike in the S sounds right here. We just want to make sure that that bubble is right over the harshest part of our S sounds. Take this little box that says threshold, and suddenly, whoa, we're getting a really dynamic equalization here, right? What you're gonna see is that we can define a threshold at which to turn those down dynamically instead of statically. This band over here is static. It's always going to be removing, what did we say, like 2 dB from, I don't know, 160 hertz or something like that. This one only turns on when it's needed, right? And you'll happen to notice that it's mostly only needed when I say the S sound. We are able to define this threshold, this blue line here with this threshold knob. We give it a ratio and we say, hey, once it crosses this line, turn it down by this amount of ratio, whatever you choose. I have 2.8, I think that sounds pretty natural. And we can also define the attack and release of this motion here, right? So the attack will define how quickly we react to this sound going over the threshold line. How quickly can we turn it down? And then the release is kind of like how long after that do we let go and release the sound back to its normal state. All right, so just to contrast, here's with all of our EQ settings dialed in for this voice, this microphone, this room. I promise I'll stop after this. And here it is without all those settings. And it's a little less pleasant to listen to, right? It's not awful. It's not too bad, I hope. God, I hope. And it's just a little less harsh. You shouldn't necessarily notice a huge change, but you should notice the absence of those problem frequencies. All right, let's talk about number 2, dynamic control. Again, at the risk of making the audio engineers mad, dynamics are like the loudest parts and quietest parts of your recording. For me, I tend to talk pretty loud and also pretty quiet. And I don't want there to be a huge discrepancy between those two things. If my viewer has to turn their volume up and down to match me the whole time they're watching, I've failed. All right, maybe not failed, but you get it, right? If you're talking down here the entire stream and then suddenly you start yelling, it's one of those like rip headphone users moments that you really want to avoid. So how do we control the dynamic range of our recording, right? We use a thing called a compressor. Say it with a compressor. And maybe you've heard of these, and maybe you haven't, but you're gonna hear about them today. At a super simple level, compressors work by turning down the volume of anything over a defined threshold. And not unlike our dynamic EQ, it's sort of an automated volume knob rather than a static one. The result of that is something like you're hearing right now, right? If I talk pretty quietly, or if I yell pretty loudly, you are hearing just about the same level of volume regardless. So how do we accomplish that? With a plugin, just like before. And actually, the same brand of plugin. I also use a Tokyo Dawn Records compressor. And you know, it is worth noting that I am not sponsored by TDR in any way. I just happen to really like their products. Although, obviously, right? Tokyo Dawn, hey, hit me up. I'm gonna be using TDR Kotelnikov. Kotelnikov. I said it right the first time. I believe this one's marketed as like a wideband dynamics processor, but for you and me, right, this is gonna be our compressor in our effect chain. And actually, I'm gonna be using 2 instances of this plugin, so I'll pull them up on the screen and you can follow along. All right, here we are. I have turned off the 2 instances of this compressor, and you can probably hear a difference, right? If I'm talking down here, or if I'm talking up here, you're hearing 2 very different things, right? And we shouldn't be. We don't want to be, at least. So we've got our 2 blank instances of Kotelnikov loaded up, and currently they're not doing anything. Compressors don't work by making quiet stuff loud so much as they just make everything kind of homogeneous at one volume, right? And we do that by turning down loud things. But right now, we haven't defined what a loud thing is. And we're gonna do that by adjusting the threshold knob here. But before I do, I kind of want to explain why 2 instances of the compressor. And you certainly don't have to do it this way, but it does seem to get me better results when I do this in sort of a 2-phase approach. The first phase is going to be anything that's like extremely loud. I'm talking like sudden fits of laughter, hitting the mic, right? That sound sucks. I don't want that to explode the eardrums of all of my viewers and listeners. So I'm going to set a threshold for just very loud things that's normally outside of my like general speaking volume. And weirdly, the way that you're gonna do this is kind of by yelling, right? Like you can see like when I laugh, like those louder sounds here kind of peak somewhere, I don't know, around here. I'm kind of pushing my voice to hit those thresholds. I want to hit a little bit. I want to take a little bit off the top of the most extreme volume with this first instance of the compressor. So I'm gonna set it, I don't know, somewhere around like 18. That seems perfect for me, right? And again, you're gonna sound like an absolute idiot setting a lot of these up. You're gonna have to make the sound that you plan on making later. And that's weird and uncomfortable. Do it while nobody's home, I don't know. So because that instance of the compressor is only gonna be working on extreme sounds, we want to get a lot of compression out of it, right? Not just a little bit. We really want to lop the top off of all of those big waveforms, those really high volume sections. Now that we've set a threshold, we have to set a ratio. Any sound that comes over this defined threshold, how much do we want to turn it down? How severely do we want to turn it down? Since this instance of the compressor is working with those extremely loud sounds, I like to have this one set kind of high. I think 4-to-1 has been pretty good for what I'm doing. And you'll notice this like blue gain reduction bar start popping up. Whenever we talk over that threshold, we'll see that it gets pulled down quite a bit. And at the same volume, I'm not getting nearly as much when the ratio is lower. So we want a little bit more. Not unlike the EQ, right? We have this attack and release function here. And those are gonna define, you know, once something comes over this threshold, how quickly do we want to turn the volume down on it? And how quickly do we want to unturn the volume down? For me, when I'm streaming on Twitch, when I'm doing like podcast editing, I like to have a pretty quick attack. I like to have like, I don't know, a millisecond or so. And you'll notice that like, as soon as you come over, boom, we are like kind of immediately turning the volume down on it as soon as we hit over that threshold. For this sort of application, I also want kind of a quick release. If I yell into the microphone and then I talk like normal, I don't want the volume to still be turned down so you can't hear my normal level of speech. I want it to have come back up by then. So I'm gonna turn this pretty much all the way down. I like mine at, I don't know, 20 milliseconds. Your mileage may vary. That might not be a sound that you like, but I really do like, and I'm trying to peek the mic here, I really do kind of like to be able to go back and forth between the dynamic ends of my volume. All right, now that we've set our sort of, extreme end of things up here, we're gonna come down here for everything else. Right now, if I get really quiet and then I talk kind of like normal, there's still kind of a big discrepancy between those two volumes. And I would like there to be less of one. But it's actually kind of the same process as before, except kind of in reverse. What I like to do is dial in kind of the quietest part of this, right? I don't know, maybe somewhere around here. That's as low as I think that I'll talk on a stream. When I talk louder than that, I want everything to be kind of squished down to closer to that level so that the gulf between those two isn't quite as wide. And for this one, we really don't need as extreme a ratio here. I usually look at something around like, I don't know, 2.8, 3.2, your mileage may vary, your voice, your microphone, your room, etc. And up here we had a really fast attack to chop down some of those really loud sounds before they could hurt anybody's ears. Down here, we're just kind of leveling things and mellowing them out, so we don't need them to be quite as quick on the attack. I'm listening, I'm hearing something like 10 milliseconds, that sounds pretty good to me. As soon as it crosses over the threshold, it doesn't have to immediately drop down. I want to give it, a little bit of buffer there. If I get really loud, it slowly, gradually brings things down. Again, with that release though, I really don't need much of it. For just talking and stuff like that, I bring mine down pretty much as far as it'll go. I want to get back to that normal volume as quickly as possible. And the last thing that I'll do on this second instance is play with the makeup gain a little bit. I kind of like, you see this bar that happens when you're talking? I like that to be, I don't know, kind of right at 0 when I'm having a normal conversational level of volume. I kind of want it to hit right about here. All right, so now that we have this set up, I can talk quietly, I can talk loudly, and they're basically the same volume for the listener, right? For me, that means that I don't have to worry too much about controlling my volume or my distance from the microphone. It's basically going to be a wash by the time it hits your ears, and that's pretty nice. Bypass them. Great, so if I'm talking quietly, and if I'm talking loudly, those are very different volumes. And then when I turn them back on, hey, look at that. We're talking quietly and loudly, and it's all kind of the same. Hey, good job hanging in there. You're like 2/3 of the way done. That's like 66.6 repeating % better audio or something. The last thing we got to talk about is volume control, and this one's easy. This one's super easy. It's built into like every software you're going to use. I'm going to show you how it works in OBS Studio, and then maybe we can talk about some other stuff later. For our purposes in this video, when I say volume control, I'm talking about basically two things. One, turning the volume down when I'm not talking, right? We call that noise gating. And two, the overall volume of the whole thing. All right, at least in OBS Studio, you click the little 3 dots next to your microphone, you hit filters, and you get brought to this page. And normally it's empty, but if you've been following along, maybe you already added an EQ or a couple of compressors. If you haven't added any filters to your microphone in OBS Studio before, you can just right click, hit add, and choose the effect that you're looking for. And you might notice that there is already an EQ in there. There's already a compressor in there. And then you also might notice that I didn't use either of them. And these built-in ones, they're not that bad, right? Don't get me wrong. I just happen to think that Nova and Kotelnikov are better in just about every single way. And those are considered VST plugins. You just put a copy of them into your OBS plugins folder so that way you can use them here. You choose VST plugin from the list, and you choose which plugin from the dropdown. For the ones we're gonna talk about now though, I'm looking at noise gate, gain, and limiter. Those are built in to OBS, so we don't have to do anything to get those to show up in the list here. Noise gate allows you to set a threshold for when the microphone should be closed and considered off, and when it should be open. And so when I make a sound over this threshold, it opens the gate and lets sound through. When I stop making those noises, when sound gets below this closed threshold, all of the sound stops. Everything is gated out. You also get an attack and release function, just like in the other two plugins. Like how quickly after we reach this threshold do we want to open the gate? And how long do we want to keep that gate open? So obviously the bigger the attack time, the longer it takes for that gate to open after you hit the threshold. So if we make this like a comically large number, when you start talking, you might cut off some of the beginning of your word. Hold time is how long the gate stays open. So we might have that set really high, really low, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. For me, I'm just trying to sort of like gently quiet down after I stop talking. So I give it 400 milliseconds and then another 1200 milliseconds to slowly taper the gate closed as opposed to slamming it shut. If I set these to 0 and I stop making sounds, you might notice that the gate slams shut in the middle of my sentence and it sounds kind of weird and disjointed. And you talk kind of quietly, get this weird sort of mess in the middle where it is like kind of opening and closing really rapidly because it can't quite get a read on your volume. For me, I found that these settings are pretty decent. Your mileage may vary. I want to talk about gain and limiter as basically extensions of each other. If you're using one, maybe consider using the other. You don't always have to, but sometimes it's really helpful. Gain is pretty simple. It's just a volume knob. The middle is 0. To the right is higher volume. To the left is lower volume. I have mine set at about 12 dB right now. And you can hear, obviously, this is just a slider. Now, limiter sort of sets the maximum possible volume, right? It isn't a volume slider, notably. Gain works to increase and decrease volume, but limiter says nothing above this certain threshold gets out the door. We're gonna hard cut anything above this threshold, which I currently have set to -1 dB, and we're just gonna chop it right off. I have kind of a quick release set on mine. You might have better luck with a longer one, but I do like to have my threshold set somewhere just below 0 dB, so that way we're not clipping the top of our meter all the time. Once you've decided what that upper limit is for you, and again, I think somewhere around -1 dB is really reasonable, make sure that your gain isn't too terribly high, because while the limiter will stop loud sounds from getting out, it also kind of mangles loud sounds. Right now, I've got my settings kind of dialed in so that I'm like right at the upper end of those meters in OBS that show you how loud you're being. If I were to push my gain too high, thinking that this limiter was gonna save me from having audio that's too loud, I would be sorely mistaken. You're gonna start to hear like crunchiness, distortion, really bonkers sounds coming out of the limiter when the gain is too high going into it. So make sure that that's dialed in somewhere, I don't know, for me, it's between 10 and 12, somewhere in there. For you, again, based on your microphone and how loud you are in general, that's really gonna vary. You might have to pull this down a little bit before you start hitting that issue with the limiter. All right, we've done all 3 steps now, right? We've got our first step, that frequency control, our second step, that dynamics control, and our third step, that volume control. And if we remove all of those, you're gonna hear what it sounded like beforehand, and it's gonna be incredibly different. Here's what it sounds like before we dialed in those settings. It's pretty quiet, for one. That's a big change, right? Our dynamic range, if I'm talking quietly, and if I'm talking loudly, those are very different volumes. We don't have a noise gate in there. We get those weird frequencies in the S's, and I guess at this volume, you're maybe not hearing them quite as much, those boomy frequencies at the bottom. But now that we've dialed everything in, we don't have to worry too much about that, right? Everything sounds pretty clean. There's a baseline level of polish at play here that is really gonna set you apart from other streamers, from other YouTubers, wherever you're posting your content. So hopefully that helps at least a little bit. If there were parts of this video that weren't very clear to you, or you could use like a step-by-step guide on a particular portion of the video, please let me know, throw it in the comments, and I'll see what I can do for you. In the meantime, hey, you can find me over on Twitch if you're so inclined. If I'm live and you have a question, I'm more than happy to answer it. I will pause my game to answer whatever questions I can for you. I'll throw a link to that and all the stuff we talked about today in the description below, and I'll also put a link to our D&D podcast, Vibe Proficiency. Go check that out wherever you listen. All right, take it easy.